It's been 2 weeks since this whole thing started. It all started with a tanker accident. It was all over the news. Everyone thought it was just another oil spill. There were plenty of volunteers, plenty of people waiting to help the poor, defenseless animals. Plenty of victims. Within hours of the tanker accident, it started happening. The animals had gone crazy. They were scratching and biting the cleanup volunteers. They said that it was an adverse effect to whatever was in that tanker. Rescue workers were still trying to get the crew out of the ship. They could hear screaming inside. There were screams to open the doors. But that's when it went to all hell, as soon as they cut the door out. There were 6 minutes of broadcast before it went silent. 6 minutes of screaming and agony. The ship's crew attacked the rescue workers like rabid baboons. They were breaking bones and tearing flesh. The people on the shore weren't faring any better. Those that had been attacked by animals were attacking everyone else. It was worse than any war zone report. It was sheer brutality, and yet the broadcast still went on for 6 entire minutes. There was 6 minutes, and then blank faces. Nobody could explain what was happening. They tried to continue with the regular news, the economy, the weather, and a cute human interest story, but they couldn't make us unsee what we saw. I tried to continue with my regular existence, but every time I switched on the news or walked by a newsstand, it was there, this big mystery. They had some explanations. It was an infection or maybe brain parasites, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the infection we were afraid of. It was them. 4 days after the initial report, a state of emergency was raised, and yet, we've all seen this before. It's in every zombie movie ever. People didn't know who to trust. People were stockpiling food and weapons. Some tried to flee, but it seems every zombie movie was right. They didn't make it. 3 days later, they arrived at my town. I expected moans, shuffling corpses, and dismemberment. But that's where the movies lied. They ran through the streets, screaming. I remember running to my front door as fast as I could, locking and barricading, and doing anything to make sure it would stay shut. And then I headed for the window. I was on the 2nd story, and I could see the carnage. They were unstoppable. They were aware. A group of them made their way through a building across the street. They jumped straight through the plate glass windows. Even the shards slicing through them made no difference. They kept coming. My barricade wasn't going to hold. I rushed around my flat, grabbing supplies and jamming them into the most secure room of the flat. I went back for one last look across the street, and I wish I hadn't. In a 2nd-story window, my face met one of theirs. They knew where I was. I quickly dashed into the room and locked the door. I don't have any kind of panic room or a secure basement, so the safest place I could think of was my bathroom. There were no windows, and only one door that had a lock. I had filled my sink and bathtub full of water so I could stay for a while, and I sat there in the dark room with the distant screams in my ears. I began to feel like I may have overreacted. It had been about 2 hours with no sign of them. It actually got quieter, and I thought that they had moved on. Maybe I could just leave the room and get to the kitchen. I could go grab some more food and wait it out. And a crash came from the front door. There was the sound of someone using full force into the door and knocking it down, the barrier behind it. There were a couple more crashes before I knew they were inside. There were rapid footsteps moving around the flat, a couple of screams, and then a bang on the wall beside me. My eyes were opened to their widest, even in the pitch black darkness of the room. There was another bang, and then another. They knew I was there, and they knew I was scared. This was the zombie nightmare I had expected from the start. I had nowhere to run, and there was only so much time before they would break in. I sat with my back to the door, hoping my extra weight would make it harder for them to get in. Then it got worse. "Why don't you open the door?" There was a voice on the opposite side of the door. There were no screams or moans, just a quiet, whispery voice. And then more of them. "We've come for you. You'll be happier if you open the door. It's not so bad." The whispery voices became a cacophony of noise trying to persuade me, to break me, to fool me. I'd heard that the moaning of zombies would drive people insane, but this was worse. A siren call. I sat in the darkness and hoped and prayed that they'd get bored. But they don't get bored, and they don't leave. I managed to use the mirror to peek under the door, only to be greeted with horrible, unblinking eyes, blood-smeared faces, screams, and more horrible whispers. That was 2 days ago. I don't know what to do anymore. Maybe it won't be so bad. On July 18th, 2020, NASA launched a new vessel. 6 astronauts boarded Goliath 1 and set off to prepare their first human colony on the moon. The preparations were expected to take a year, but the vessel carried 6 months of additional food past that expectation in case of emergency. Radio communication was possible only on the side of the moon facing the Earth. The astronauts were told to stay in this area to maintain radio contact. The astronauts had landed on the eastern border of the Serenitatis. This lunar mare was largely covered in basalt and held a few craters, making it perfect for colonization. The goal of the astronauts was simple: map the area for colonization and blueprint the construction of the buildings. The only real danger on the moon was meteors striking it, as the moon was devoid of any atmosphere. An electronic journal of the day's event was to be sent back to NASA, along with any interesting photos or videos, although it was to be seen if anything exciting could happen. It was the moon, after all. The first few months of journals were fairly normal. The astronauts were right on schedule with the predicted progress. They wasted no time to blueprint the area. Everything in a normal town was to be in the future town: a grocery store, a school, a hospital, among many other things. Now, of course, these supplies would need to be sent by other vessels. It wasn't their mission to build anything. Then, on the 17th of September that year, the daily report had not come. It was speculated that it was forgotten, but didn't come the next day either. Radio communication was not successful with the astronauts, and was only met with static. The radio tower was seen as working perfectly. It seemed that the astronauts were simply not within range of it. Several missing videos were later recovered from the site. The following is a description of each video. The astronauts were told to label their videos by date, using numbers following the date if more than one video was recorded that day. The first video was labeled appropriately as September 16th, 2020. It was around 10 minutes long and is mostly spent examining small craters near the border of the mare. Near the end of the video, the astronauts talk about hearing scratching noises from the crater, but this wasn't audible. That journal, sent to NASA for the 16th of September, did not mention this noise. The second video is labeled also, appropriately as September 17th, 2020. This video was also focused around craters, specifically near the Bessel crater. This is an exceptionally large crater, over 9 miles across and a mile deep. The plan was to eventually build a bridge across the crater. This video is roughly the same length as the previous video. The astronauts began to make notes of the crater when the scratching sound is heard again. This time, however, it is quite audible and appears to be coming from the basin of the crater. The sound becomes so loud, it begins to irritate the astronauts. One of the men looks down over the edge to find the source of the sound. A force unseen by the camera suddenly pulls the astronaut into the crater. His screams are heard briefly before the camera is cut short. The third and final video is labeled Code 7700. Please help. The date is unknown, but it can be assumed it is probably the next day. It begins with an astronaut in an oxygen tank talking to the camera. He explains in a calm voice that he has been unable to contact the radio. He also explains about how two of the astronauts have been horribly slaughtered. At this point, tears start to roll down his face, but he continues in a calm tone. The scratching noise from the previous videos is heard suddenly and sharply. The camera is knocked to an adjacent wall of the tent, and we listen to the astronaut pleading, followed by a heavy thump. The man continues to plead and cry out for help, stating that he can't breathe. The camera is completely turned away from the man, so it is not seen what is attacking him. We see blood begin to splatter the adjacent wall. The man continues to scream for help and is now completely bawling. Blood splatters against the wall for a second time, against the wall alongside the sound of bones snapping and flesh being torn from them. His pleas for help suddenly stop and are just reduced to screaming and crying. As blood splatters against the wall again, a bit of brown liquid now mixes with the bright red liquid, and the tearing sound has since been replaced with that of squishing and squashing. The only sound the man makes now is a quiet death rattle. And suddenly, the man goes silent and several of his organs are tossed near the direction of the wall. Coincidentally, the night of September 18th was a red moon. None of the bodies of the astronauts from Goliath 1 were ever fully recovered. Colonization of the moon had been postponed until further notice. The team sent to investigate the radio communication problems the astronauts were having refused to talk to the public. Of the 4-man repair team, 2 have committed suicide since returning to Earth. While the 3 videos were recovered, a photograph was also recovered. It is still unknown as to what the photograph is. I've always loved urban legends. Just the simple idea of a paranormal or supernatural entity sparked my interest. Between haunted houses and cryptids, some could say that I was obsessed, but they didn't understand the need for knowledge I felt. That was the main reason I decided to travel to this town, Bristol, Tennessee. I decided to only rent a room in a small motel. I had no desire to stay long and only rented my room for a few days. My reason for being here came from the local legend that a friend had told me about. I had even stopped at the nearest bar to get the latest gossip. What mainly brought this place to life, though, was the missing person posters all over town. I introduced myself to the bartender and asked him for the latest news. He chuckled lightly and asked if I watched the news. I did have a TV in my room, but all I seemed to get from it was old shows in black and white. I told the bearded man of my technology crisis, and he seemed to chuckle. The bartender grabbed the glass and poured whiskey into the clear cup. I grabbed my beverage and took a quick sip. The bartender rubbed together his thumb and pointer finger as a sign for money. I quickly complied and slipped him a 10. He told me about the recent disappearance of a young boy who ventured into a cavern. This sparked my interest, and I asked further about it. What could have possibly made this boy just suddenly disappear? There could be a number of reasons, but without the boy or his body, there was almost no way to tell for sure. The bartender told me about the growing fear of the cave. For some odd reason, the town's citizens begin to believe that the cave held something supernatural. My curiosity piqued. I asked him if it had something to do with the various missing people posters around town. He confirmed my inquiry with a grunt and a nod. He went even further by telling me that the townspeople believed their loved ones were still trapped inside the cavern, even after all these years. But it seemed that outsiders found the idea preposterous, which can be assumed from logical human beings. I decided to ask the bartender where the cave was. I found it particularly odd how he knew so much about this cavern, but I chalked it up to hearing the local gossip. The bartender's face twisted in a look of suspicion, almost like he was displeased with my prodding for information, and he asked me why I wanted to know where it was. I lied to the man and told him I was doing a school documentary on urban legends and that this cavern was being used as an example. The look of disbelief on his face made it obvious that my bluff failed. I grabbed my beverage and took a long drink before slamming the glass back onto the countertop. This was hopeless. I began to turn away with my hand still on the rim of the glass. The man quickly pressed his hand down on top of mine. His skin felt wrinkled and sweaty on top of my own. I glared at the man and asked him to let go of me. He simply told me the location of the cave. I still to this day have no idea why he did what he did. I like to believe that he had a personal reason for telling me, but I really have no reason to believe that. All I knew at that moment was that I needed to visit immediately. I left the building as soon as I got the location and headed to the motel. I arrived at the small building and entered. My feet slapped against the carpet, and I quickly turned the knob and entered my room. My eyes flickered around the small space as my jaw dropped. I stared at the devastation before me. Broken tiles were hanging off the wall, and most of my possessions were lying about, as if a tornado had gone through. I began to collect my possessions off the ground and pack them away. There was no way I was going to stay here after someone broke into the hotel and trashed my room. But what didn't add up in my head was why someone would do this. Perhaps this was the work of someone I knew. No, it couldn't be. None of my friends knew where I was staying, and they wouldn't prank me this way. Maybe it was someone from the town. I mean, yes, that must have been it. It had to be. But I arrived in this little town just last night. It didn't add up, unless someone from the bar overheard me. But then again, how have they learned where I was staying? I jumped onto my torn-up bed and laid the blankets and pillows in the same position they were when I had left. I needed to take my mind off of this for the night. Unfortunately, I had not slept well that night. It must have been the worst sleep of my life. My nightmares consisted of my spelunking in the infamous cavern. In my nightmare, I was walking inside a large rocky cave. I felt the need to escape the place for some odd reason. I began to move across the area and spotted several bats hanging from the ceiling. Nothing unusual for a cavern. Bats preferred the dark, so they were bound to be in these kinds of areas. The stone I walked upon felt slippery underneath my sneakers, so I made sure to take my time walking. But something was not right. It felt like I had been walking around the cave for what seemed like hours, and yet I hadn't managed to discover another path, no exit. It's almost as if I was transported into this exitless cave. How would I get out? How would I eat or drink? I began to panic and banged on the walls. I yelled in my panic. Fear rose along with anxiety and anger, but fear was not the main root. It was a horrid feeling. I looked all around the cave once more, and once more again, noticed the lack of any sort of exit that led outside this large underground dome of stone. I looked to the ceiling to see the bats once again, but something seemed off. One of the bats seemed much larger than the others, unnaturally so. Its large fangs seemed to shine in the darkness, exposing its head. I stared at the creature with curiosity and fear. It looked like an oversized bat, but it also looked vaguely humanoid in shape. It opened its wings and let out a large screech. Its clawed feet let go of the stalagmite and fell down towards the hard ground beneath it. The creature outstretched its wings and began to glide downwards towards me. I let out a scream of fear and ran in the opposite direction. I quickly collided into a solid wall due to my limited space. The monstrosity lunged towards me in an attempt to capture me. I jumped to the side and felt something sharp pierce my skin. I quietly looked at my shoulder and spotted 3 large slashes. Blood erupted from the wound and stained the rock below with a sickening crimson. I let out a whimper of pain and spit onto the stone. The creature had regained its composure and took slow steps towards me. I jumped down a ledge to my side and prepared to hit the ground below. I felt something wrap around my torso, arms and legs, as I fell and realized that I was suspended in midair by vines. I grasped the vines and began to pull, but only felt the vegetation constrict my limbs even tighter. Anxiety washed over me. It was going to get me. I looked around, all over the place. It was above me and was sure to attack soon. I let out a cry of terror as the beast fell down with a sickening screech and grabbed me. Its hands appeared to be attached to its wings, as they were slightly wrapped around my body. Its mouth opened widely. Its razor-sharp teeth were stained a deep crimson. I realized why, as it swung its teeth into the clavicle of my neck. My eyes shot open as soon as the sharp teeth made contact with my skin. I grimaced as I thought about my night terror. I jumped off my bed and quickly freshened up before I began to pack up my belongings. I exited my room quietly and carried boxes of my stuff to my car. After what happened to my apartment, that meant the person who did this knew where I lived, and they could just easily do it again, or worse. I quickly put the stack of boxes into the trunk of my car. My stomach churned at the thought of last night's horror. I had no choice. Either leave town and return home, or visit the cave, and then hopefully go home. After the nightmare, I wasn't sure if I wanted to risk going there. Surely the idea of some sort of bat monster was purely fictional, but something caused those people to disappear. No, it had to be something else, I told myself as I rejected the idea. It was just a nightmare after all. There was no way something like that could ever exist. It couldn't hurt to go there and find nothing out of the ordinary. After all, it was only a dream, and dreams were only the imagination's way of projecting an idea or a thought. And so I drove to the cavern, and I entered it. Vegetation creeped down from the top of the entrance. Clearly, this place wasn't kept in the best of shape. It didn't even look like civilization had touched it. An entire forest had sat upon the large cavern. So why were people coming here? I pushed the question aside and entered the large opening. It was big. Branching paths started from the stone and led in different directions everywhere. I even spotted one that went in a circle. I turned on my flashlight and began to explore. Most of the paths led nowhere or just intersected back into the original. I spotted small puddles in between various rocks and even some nice-looking minerals sticking out from the walls. I found the experience to be quite peaceful. I never had a problem with the dark, and the deafening silence was peaceful in its own right. I noticed in my exploration that the underground cave was completely different from the one in my nightmare. There was almost no relation between the two. I decided to head out. There didn't seem to be much else to look for. I didn't want to get lost in the stone prison, and I spotted a lot of bats hanging from the ceiling. I shined my light up at one and it screeched at me. I snickered at the small creature and resumed walking back. And it took me a second to realize that I still need to learn about the missing people. What if they were further into the cave? What if they simply got lost like I feared I would? But it could also be anything else. There's any number of reasons that could explain the disappearances. Runaways, kidnapping, maybe murders. They couldn't still be here. I mean, God, I would hope not. I began to walk out of the cavern, but winced as I felt an odd burning sensation on my neck, almost like I had gotten sunburnt. I twisted my head at just the right angle and spotted bright red marks on my neck. It felt on fire, almost like someone was holding a match to it. I felt very uneasy and stopped in place. I looked further into the cave and felt my heart drop as I spotted a large silhouette hanging from the leaky ceiling close to me. I felt my muscles tighten around the bone beneath my skin and turn me into a human statue. Maybe it was simply a stalagmite, but its form was too rigid. It also seemed to be rocking back and forth. I didn't take my eyes off the swinging form as the bottom part of it seemed to move around irregularly. I really couldn't describe it due to the darkness, and I dreaded to shine my flashlight on it in fear of it being something hostile. What looked to be its head shifted as what I thought to be its mouth opened, revealing a pearly white row of fangs. Its slimy red tongue slipped outside of its maw, while its jaw stretched out. And I hope it wasn't waking up. I took slow movements backwards as my muscles finally began to relax. Why was my body in such a state of stress? The creature's head began to move around more frequently until its eyelids opened, revealing precise black orbs. They darted around in the thing's sockets until its eyes looked straight ahead. Its eyes looked to be bulging out of its skull until it spontaneously took a sniff at the air. What was it doing? And I found out my answer when its head pointed in my direction. The burning in my neck increased into a searing pain. I felt the spot on my neck and noticed that my flesh had become irritated. It turned around and began to walk away at a fast rate. A screech was let out as I could hear a loud flapping sound. My fast walk turned into jogging, which quickly turned into sprinting. I slammed my sneakers against the wet stone for what felt like hours as I continued to sprint away in my frenzy. I felt like it was getting closer and closer to me. I thought it was going to be breathing down my neck within seconds, but I managed to stay away. I finally made my way to the entrance and saw that the sky was now darkened and covered with puffy clouds. I quickly took out my keys and used my remote car starter. The lights of the high beams turned on and shined a blinding light into the vine-covered entrance. The creature let out an ear-piercing cry and fell onto the ground as it attempted to cover its eyes. It quickly looked in the other direction and flew into the sky as it was carried by the wind. I stared into the sky as the creature made its way into the woods on top of the cavern. I got back into the car and drove right home. When my mother called me and attempted to learn where I was, I simply told her I was sightseeing. I never found out what happened to those poor people. I still wonder if the figure happened to be the monster in my dream. I can't help but make the connections. What does concern me is that the burning in my neck not only was in the same place in my dream, but the burning also comes and goes. Mainly at night, when bats roam around. It's a quiet, normal-looking suburban neighborhood, and I hate it when my work brings me places that remind me of my own home. It doesn't make what I do easy. Then again, this job isn't meant to be easy. I park my van in front of a house. A decent cookie-cutter two-story, nothing special. I look down at my watch. It's 5:30. I'm right on time. I take a sip of my coffee. I need to be alert. There can't be any mistakes. And I glance at my rear views to make sure no one's wandering the streets. I was made once. It got real messy. But I was a rookie then. I've gotten good at this since. Once I'm sure that the coast is clear, I step out of my van carrying a large duffel. I stop for a second to check my reflection in the window. I straighten my tie and brush some dust off of my shoulders. Professionalism is key. Professionalism is the cornerstone of success. That's what they drilled into me during my training for this job. I approach the front door. There's no need to knock. No one will answer. I take a lock-picking device from my duffel and easily open the door and push it open. The smell immediately hits me. It's not a strange smell. I'm quite used to it by now. The iron-like stench of blood mixed with the scant akin to rotting meat. It's not pleasant, but it no longer bothers me. There are two bodies in the living room. Teenage girls, probably 16 or 17, mangled and disfigured. One is draped grotesquely over the couch, her mouth open in a silent scream. One eye is popping, and the other is staring blankly upward. There is a stab wound in her stomach. The attacker had pulled the knife downward, spilling her entrails across the couch and floor. The other girl is tangled in her bloodied sleeping bag. There are multiple puncture wounds across her body and face. I take out my camera and snap a quick picture before shutting and locking the door behind me. There's another body on the stairs. Male, late 30s, brown hair. He must have been on his way down to investigate the screams. Whatever killed him didn't take its time. His throat was slashed. A fallen baseball bat lay at the bottom of the stairs. I pick it up, examining it. He tried to protect his family, but against something he didn't even believe existed until it killed him. I feel a brief ping of admiration for the poor man. Most would be frozen by fear by what they saw. At least he put up a display of resistance, futile as it was. I snap another photo and cross into the dining room, leaving the upstairs for last. The last teenager was displayed on the table, spread eagle. Her head had been sliced off and placed on her naked stomach. Her hands and feet were also removed. The eyes had been popped out and replaced with small gold coins. I shook my head. Why was ignorance so harshly punished? I snapped a few photos before I head upstairs. I checked the master bedroom first. One body, female, mid to late 30s. She was in the closet, obviously hiding. Like the adult male, she'd been killed quickly by 3 puncture wounds, 2 in the stomach, and the final in the temple. I take another photo before continuing into the bathroom. I'm surprised by the lack of evidence. Normally, that's where everything started. Then I figured there must be something I missed in the living room. I head back down to do an additional sweep of the living room, being careful not to step on the bodies. Behind the couch was an additional bathroom with a large ornate mirror. Candles had been set up around it as well as an Ouija board. I rolled my eyes. God, when won't these kids ever learn? It's sad, really. No one deserves this. I decide to change in here for the cleanup. I shut the door, stripping out of my suit and tie and pulling on a hazmat suit and gas mask. Along with the hazmat suit, I also grab a large variety of cleaning chemicals and finally a silenced pistol. I've only had to draw 3 times, fired at once. I hate arriving early to a scene. The first time I did, well, I saw one of them. The monsters I clean up after. He was crouched over the bed of his victim, having just finished his role. It turned to me with its vicious smile. I drew my weapon and pointed it at its head. Maybe I could have killed him, or maybe he could have killed me. Either way, a monster would have died. But neither of us did anything. As much as we despised each other's roles, he recognized my necessity, and I followed my orders. Do not engage the entity. I get to work cleaning. It's difficult and painstaking, scrubbing blood out of carpets, bagging the bodies, removing all traces of whatever happened, collecting and labeling evidence. Most days I question why I do this. Is it so that we can learn about these things before we eventually and hopefully kill them? Or is it simply to keep certain events out of the public's eye? The mantra is, don't know, don't care. But it's hard to follow when I look at the fresh-faced girl as I zip the body bag shut. What kind of person was she? What kind of person would she have become? Surely no one deserves this. I close her eyes. It's against protocol to touch the body, but it seems the least I can do. Then there is a sudden knock on the door and I freeze. I slowly approach it, weapon drawn, praying that it's not the police. The only time I discharged my weapon was on a police officer. I hadn't secured the scene properly. It was my fault. I had to kill him. I'm relieved when the voice is that of an elderly woman, likely a neighbor. She won't attempt to kick the door down. She knocks one more time before leaving. I holster my weapon, relieved, and return to my grim, never-ending task. And finally, it's done. The bodies are laid out on the living room floor in airtight bags. The rest of the house looked like it could be a picture in a home sale magazine. It's pristine. Maybe I should become a realtor if I end up getting to retire. I strip off my hazmat gear and backed into my suit. I adjust the tie in the mirror. Professionalism is key. I check my watch. It's only just turned noon. I carefully pack everything into my duffel and exit out the back, making sure all the doors and windows are locked. Every day I have to wonder to myself, if I'm any better than the monsters that make the messes I clean up after. No, I don't kill innocent people, but I do cover up their deaths. In about an hour, an additional team will arrive and take the bodies to an undisclosed location to do God knows what with them. Ever wonder why certain crimes, especially relating to the paranormal, never make headlines? Well, that's because of me, and 130 others like me. It's a dark and lonely life. I'd never met any of my colleagues, so I have no support group, no one I can relate to. Interacting at a social event is painful because every time I go to a bar or a party or on a date or just have a beer with a friend, I just can't stop thinking, what if they're next? Ever since I was 4 years old, I would put on some cheap pink ballet slippers, an old tattered tutu, and some gross torn tights I had. I looked a mess, but that didn't stop me. I would climb onto my little chair and put my mother's record on the turntable with the volume all the way up, and I danced. After years of training in classical ballet, I received my first pair of pointe shoes. Excited and overjoyed for this accomplishment, my parents took me out to a fancy restaurant. The way there was grueling. The road overlooked a short cliff and raging water. I looked out my window toward the water, hoping we wouldn't slip and die. When we arrived, valet took our car and we stepped inside. I only saw walls of white with dark green patterns printed on them and golden trim. It was beautiful. We sat at a table number 33, and talked aimlessly about ballet. I ordered pasta, and we got a basket of bread. Neither of us knew this was going to be our last meal together. As we cut around the bend, a truck with its blinding headlights came ripping towards us, and Dad swerved over the railless edge of the cliff. Mom and Dad didn't survive the crash, and after a painful experience in the hospital, I went home to my aunt. When I turned 14, I started having flashbacks. I would see running water stained red, doors ripped off of a blue Volvo, and shredded tires. I'd hear what I assumed was the accident. Nothing and then everything. I could see my mother turning her head towards me, trying to yell but finding only silence. I could see my father with his hands on the wheel and his face in complete shock from what he'd done. The only sound of the crash was the car rolling, acting as a meat grinder with everything in it smashing and tearing everything inside. And then the heavy splash as the Volvo collided with the raging water. As the car began to tumble in the water, I unbuckled myself and crawled out. When I jumped out of the broken window, I felt the sharp glass mark me, and I smashed into a rock. I was hauled violently by the river into more rocks, scraping my arms and fracturing my leg. I was able to reach the bank and pull myself to safety after a current pushed me into a pool. I expected my parents to crawl out just the same. I ran with the car, or I tried to, screaming for them, but as the car kept rolling and crashing, I knew that they were gone. There were holes in the back, the doors were ripped off, and the car slowly sunk to the bottom when the river became smooth. I stood there in shock, tears rolling down my face, pain in my tonsils from screaming. And then I crashed on the grass below me and blacked out. I'm 19 now, and I've been dancing a lot. After I got out of the hospital with a fractured leg, torn wrist, and terrible wounds, I went to physical therapy and started dancing as soon as I could. I'm in a company in New York, and this year we're performing Swan Lake. Because I am the Swan Queen, I get to go to the theater and rehearse on stage by myself whenever I would like to. I strolled out of bed at 11 o'clock at night and cruised to the theater. I made my way backstage into my dressing room and dressed myself in my white swan costume. As I walked into the wings, I saw dancers, and assuming it was the other girls practicing, I joined in on my cue. I closed my eyes and let the music carry me. As I opened my eyes to see where I was on the stage, I noticed the dancers were not with the other girls. There was something wrong in the way they moved, and they all faced away from me. They moved almost like skeletons, their bones rattling every time they made a change in position. Their hair was gross, thin, and unattractive, and as I started to bray, they all turned combatively towards me, and I realized I was surrounded by corpses. Each of them did a different, disturbing move toward me in sync. When they were all close enough to touch me, they clawed at me, hunched over with long, bony fingers. I was covered in bloody scratches, and finally they stopped. They stood up straight and spun in a circle around me. Every 3 turns, they'd lean in and dig into my skin again, each one more painful than the last. Suddenly, after I cried for them to stop, another came out from their wings, and they all disappeared into the darkness. The new corpse danced an extraordinary solo and lifted me up into the air with extreme force. I screamed and became paralyzed. I was now staring at my own mother's animated corpse. Enormous black feathers began to grow out of her dry bones, forming into wings. She began to thrash around us, taking us higher and higher into the air. She looked at me with what seemed like a terrified look and dropped me onto the hard stage. The other corpses came rushing out of the darkness and began to feed on my bloody, cold, and broken body. As I was screaming for help, I heard the theater door open.
The crack of light from the lobby came through for only a second, and it vanished. It seemed to be the only light I'd seen in days. As I tried to push the corpses off, more of them came, torturing me, marking me with their devilish bones. All of them started to grow wings just like Mom. One by one, they flew 50 feet up and then dropped, breaking and vanishing in a cloud of dust, and then reappearing somewhere in the distance, only to come bolting at me again. I can remember their razor-sharp teeth coming at me, as if they could chew me up like a meat grinder, like my parents in the car. I looked up at my mother, who was now flying above me, her wings beating softly, her dry bones crumbling. And as she took one last look at me, her feathers abandoned her body, one by one, until she fell on top of me, leaving only a cloud of dust. I closed my eyes and lay there with tears rolling down my face. I could feel the blood slowly dripping off of my body. Then, my death was interrupted by an uproar of applause and cheering. As I got up and looked to see who was there, it was my choreographer, clapping, his smile beaming at me, just like my father's. And then he turned gray, his hair going from dark brown to red to white, and then thinning, his teeth sharpening into triangle-shaped razors, his skin shedding from his bones. I screamed and screamed, and the theater lit up. In every chair, a corpse sat, smiling at me with their gruesome teeth, blood on their bony hands. I tried to run, but my legs became exposed bones, my arms too. My hair began to fall at my side, my eyes sinking in and falling out. I was done. I could cry no more. My tear ducts collapsed and vanished. I felt pain all over my body, but I couldn't scream. I finally found enough strength to get up and run to my dressing room backstage. I saw the silhouette of my choreographer and other ballerinas. As I turned to run away again, they grabbed me. The room lit up and they were normal. I looked in the mirror, and staring back at me was flesh. My flesh, my brown hair up in a tight bun, my eyes blue as ever, and my legs and arms their natural peach color. I collapsed in my chair and began to cry, and they saw the marks on me where the feathers came out of my back. They huddled around me and asked what happened, but I could only cry more, so they all cuddled me. Eventually, when I stopped crying and screaming, and they had reassured me it would be all right, I looked up at them, their smiles beaming at me with razor-sharp teeth. Usually, I like to let my feet hang over the bed while I sleep. Occasionally, I like to let my arms flail about during sleep as well, but all that has changed. One night, I felt a light breeze on my heels, gently puffing on them as if a gust of wind blew by. So I drew in my feet and fell back asleep, dismissing it as being from the broken window. The next night, it happened again, somewhere in the middle of a pleasant dream. I was awakened by the sensation of someone breathing on my feet, ever so softly, ever so gently. Irritated, I drew them in once again under the blankets and fell into a terrible sleeping pattern. The next night was when things got strange. I woke up again, my eyes barely able to open, crusting over by sleep dust. In the half-light, I could barely make out a figure poking through the slates in my bunk bed. My befuddled mind tried to make sense of the shape and finally rested on an animal that had somehow broken into my house. It was not. Soft, porcelain skin shone in the darkness, framing two large, pale, black eyes. It was breathing on my feet. I froze in fear. Remember, I could barely see. It was 2 a.m. "Does it have small feetsies?" came a tiny voice, soft and childlike. "What?" I stuttered. I couldn't move now. I was too scared. "Doth it have feetsies?" the thing repeated, a little louder this time. I could now make out that whatever this thing was had some serious speech impediment. "Look," I grumbled. "You better get the fuck out of my house before I call the cops." That's when it responded by opening its mouth. By this time, I was fully awake. Though I wish I wasn't. Inside its mouth were rows and rows of sharp, thick teeth, lined all the way back to the cavernous hole of its mouth. Strangely, the story I read once called God's Mouth suddenly came to mind. Its mouth was wide that I knew this was some kind of nightmare. It chomps down on my foot, and I feel a piercing pain on my left 3 toes. I shriek into the night, and the night inhales me. Sometime in the morning, I wake up to my parents sitting over me with frightened expressions on their faces. Apparently, I had woken them up with my screaming, and they rushed into my room. They found me passed out with my foot crudely cradled in my arm. I had somehow held onto it during the night in an awkward fetal position. Upon inspection of my toes, I found nothing wrong except a few faintly visible marks lining the skin around the nails. It was slightly clammy, like I had dipped my toes in a vat of water for too long. My parents insist there was nothing in my room that night, and that I had suffered a series of night terrors. But I know better. Oh yes, I'm never sleeping with my feet out again, lest that freak come back here. No siree.